Okay, I'd like to take a slightly different tack from the other speakers. I'd like to, in a sense, pose the question of, given that we are very concerned about the state of the barrier reef, given that it is to a large extent the results of long-term monitoring programs that has helped us to be able to document and justify our concern about the state of the Great Barrier Reef. And given that there are huge challenges if we were going to reverse the decline and prevent the World Heritage Area from being pronounced World Heritage in danger, are our monitoring programs actually up to the job? So, just by way of introduction, monitoring is clearly one of the most important underpinning activities behind proper environmental management. And if you look at sort of one of the underpinning concepts behind environmental management, which is adaptive management and the adaptive management cycle, there are two specific areas where monitoring is really vital. One is in terms of assessing the initial condition and determining whether there's a problem, and second is to determining whether, in fact, the actions you've taken have actually made a difference. Now, we're all concerned about the Great Barrier Reef. We've been talking about the possibility of the reef being declared World Heritage in danger. There's been a number of inputs into this issue, in particular the strategic assessment that's been recently conducted by GBRMPA. The response of the government is to say that we want to produce a sort of an overall strategy, which they're titling Reef 2050. And under that, they are going to have what they're calling a long-term sustainability plan. It's a plan for how they are going to take actions to be able to ensure that the Great Barrier Reef doesn't decline any further and that it is not likely to be either now or in the future World Heritage in danger. Now again, monitoring has played a really important role in terms of both understanding the problem through the long-term monitoring program, but also identifying the fact that what we really need is integration of all the monitoring activities that we're doing. And one of the projects that went into the strategic assessment was how to develop an integrated monitoring framework. Not only that, but then as a result of then thinking about what should go into this long-term sustainability plan. And this is a very active area within government right now. In fact, there's meetings happening in Canberra this week to determine exactly how to progress this long-term sustainability plans. In particular, how to set goals and targets that will actually dictate what should be done and then what should be monitored. And it's been recognized that an integrated monitoring program is really important as a sort of a component of this long-term sustainability plan in order to be able to document whether in fact things are on track. So what I'd like to do is just talk about, well, are we really equipped to be able to service Reef 2050 with, in a sense, monitoring 2050? And what I'd like to argue is there are a number of areas where I think there is really room for significant improvement. First of all, I think we don't plan for our monitoring particularly well, and I'll talk about that a little bit. We probably need to innovate significantly to be able to sort of really improve monitoring, to be able to face the challenges of the future. We certainly need to integrate the monitoring programs that we have much better, and we probably need to communicate better. So I'd like to talk about those just briefly, one by one. First of all, in terms of better planning, as part of this development of an integrated monitoring framework, which fed into the strategic assessment, there was a list of what the monitoring prerequisites should be in an ideal monitoring program. And there were 9 of them listed. And I've just had a quick scan through these. And on the right, I've put question marks, ticks, or crosses as to whether I think we're actually achieving those. And by and large, there's a lot of really good sense in the things that need to be done. Clearly, we need to define the purpose of the monitoring program and its monitoring objectives. That has not always been done as well as it could be. In fact, the identification of the need to set goals and targets under the long-term sustainability plan and the conclusion from the strategic assessment that management in the future should be objective and target-based is a reflection of the fact that this is something that hasn't been done as well as it could be. And in order to be able to determine what it is that we should monitor in terms of knowing whether the targets are being met, we need to really understand what indicators we should be using. They've very rarely been properly and comprehensively selected, and they should be selected on the basis of, in fact, conceptual models. So both conceptual models and the selection of indicators are areas that are actually poorly done at present. And I'd like to talk a little bit about those. The idea of having a conceptual model is that if you really want to monitor something other than the final end product, and that's not often feasible to monitor, you really have to have an understanding of how the drivers and impacts are actually going to affect the final outstanding universal value, and then what other things may be affected in between, and to what extent any of those might be effective indicators. You really have to understand the mechanisms of impacts, the various positive and negative feedbacks. As part of another project that fit into the strategic assessment, AIMS and CSIRO worked together to see whether they could, at least one instance, look at in the instance of seagrasses and dugongs and turtle habitats, and the other instance in terms of corals. Could we at least develop a bit of a conceptual qualitative model on what the various interactions and feedback loops would be? And then could we change that into a model that is more semi-quantitative, that actually looks at individual drivers, looks at the interactions, puts nominal values on those based on feedback from stakeholders, and get an idea of exactly what the magnitude of various interactions are, and from that, in theory, select proper indicators for monitoring. So that was done, at least in this case, as a way of actually looking at understanding cumulative impacts. But I'll be talking about a particular case study that we're just embarking on that will seek to do this a bit more formally, at least in one area, to show how that type of thing can really assist in developing a proper integrated monitoring program. I'd like to now move on to the issue of new technology or innovation. Now, monitoring is often one of the most expensive aspects of effective environmental management. It costs a lot of money to get out there, especially in the marine environment, and monitor these variables. And as a result, we're almost always resource constrained. And there are areas that we don't monitor, and there are areas that we do monitor that we don't monitor adequately. And my view is that while it would be nice to get more resources, that's always not always going to be possible. And if we did get them, we want to make sure we're using them as effectively as possible. And that new technologies do have a really important role to play, I think, in the next decade in terms of really being able to monitor more effectively. New technology can allow us to go into areas that are deeper, that are even shallower, that are very turbid, or even too dangerous to normally go with standard diver-based techniques. And they also increase efficiency through automated processes a great deal. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the areas where new technology is beginning to show some results and where it might go in the future. Because we think this is a really important area that is going to play a very important role in improving the effectiveness of monitoring and research generally on the Great Barrier Reef, we actually have a new program at AIMS called Data, Technology and Innovation, led by Lyndon Llewellyn. And its goals are to, first of all, expand the range of autonomous and automated observing systems on the reef and throughout Australia, and also to ensure that we actually have the proper electronic information management and dissemination systems that will make sure that when we do it right, we actually communicate it right as well. So what are the kinds of things where technology can play a role? Well, one of the main monitoring activities that AIMS does on the Great Barrier Reef is the broad-scale, long-term monitoring of the reef. And we use manta-tow techniques. And that's not exactly cutting-edge technology anymore. We've been using the same technique for about 30 years. It involves a diver being towed behind a boat. Now, we've made some improvements lately where we're using mobile phone technology to start logging at least more accurately the position of the boat around a reef. And ultimately, we'll be then doing data logging on the boat. And this will save time and therefore expenses. But there's really a lot further we could go in terms of improving how we actually go about doing these broad-scale surveys. And bear in mind that I didn't show the graph because I think it's had lots of exposure, but the long-term 27-year decline of the Great Barrier Reef showing 50% drop in coral cover was all based on these long-term data sets from manta towing. So one of the areas where we've had to use a different technique for broad-scale surveys is up in the northwest, where we've been monitoring in areas which are very turbid, croc-infested, and also very deep. And we've used, and this is not exceptionally new, towed video technology to be able to do two things. First of all, cover a big area without having to get into the water, get a general view of the area through a forward-looking video camera, but also take regular high-resolution stills lit by strobe so you get even lighting so that we can do formal analysis as you would with a normal line transect. But they can cover vast areas. And by doing that, and this is an example of one of the shoals we've been monitoring up in the northwest, these are pinnacles that are in some cases dominated by corals, but certainly dominated by either seagrass, algae, or corals for a lot of their surface. And we've been able to do a number of tows using the video across the entire shoal. We do multi-beam at the same time, so we have very accurate estimates of bathymetry, but also rugosity, which it helps us to define habitat. You can see some of the forward-looking photographs that we get from this. But what we're able to do by analyzing the stills along these kinds of transects, which are going across known gradients, we can actually then using our high-resolution bathymetry, actually drape data on, for instance, the level of coral cover across the entire area. So this is the type of thing we ought to be thinking about doing on the reef, is being able to map out an entire reef and saying, well, look, here's our modeled estimate of coral cover or soft coral cover on that particular area. Now, what we want to do, that's in the future, is to actually start transitioning to towed video, even on the Great Barrier Reef, so that eventually we may not have to have divers towed behind the reef. It's expensive, it's very tiring for people. We would hopefully be able to actually double up our trouble, the amount of monitoring we actually do for the same cost if we didn't actually have to pay for as many salaries, for instance. And so we could look at that as being a really new area of work. So believe me, the people who do this in the field would be gainfully employed doing the analysis in the higher level science. So it's not a matter of just making people redundant. It's a matter of making people, sort of getting people to do what they're really most expert at. But what we really want to do is look at doing real-time feeds from the towed video back up onto the boat so we can be analyzing as it goes. We want to be able to look at image analysis to be able to take the analyst out of the loop, except for using expert intervention, and also using new technology to be able to fly our towed video directly over the surface at a constant height, which makes a huge difference in terms of the quality of the data. Now, it still takes a boat to tow these towed videos around. Ultimately, we will be looking at whether we can use automated surface vehicles to be able to actually program them to travel around the reef and take water samples, to take oceanographic measurements, and ultimately to be able to tow one of these videos behind it so that we can actually have a series of robots running around the reef, gathering this kind of long-term data and actually incredibly increasing the coverage that we can get on the reef. And finally, one of the areas that worries me is that if you're aware of the long-term monitoring program on the Great Barrier Reef, the detailed analysis of photographs is restricted to one depth in one corner of a small number of reefs. And so while the broad-scale surveys at least do the perimeter, there is very little known about the reef top and very little detailed study known about the other bits of the perimeter other than what divers estimate during their manta tows. By using UAVs, we will be able to actually start monitoring perhaps regularly some of the areas that have been very poorly studied. And these include reef flats, which are actually exposed at low tide at least 2 or 3 times a year and allow us to take fairly high resolution images through which you could determine quite a few very important variables such as coral cover. Now, that's broad-scale surveys. We also do fine-scale surveys where we actually have divers taking a still camera along fixed transects, and that's where we get a lot of our really detailed information on the coral cover and the species composition and community changes. Ultimately, using UAVs or AUVs, autonomous underwater vehicles, we should be able to do the same thing again with higher replication and in some cases even higher resolution using stereo pairs. And we've been working with the Center for Field Robotics and Stefan's group to use their AUV. But ultimately what we want to do is have a fleet of about 20 or 30 of these which are moving around the reef and across the reef, capturing high resolution benthic images that you can get right down to species on at a fraction of the cost. So that's where innovation and technology could play a role. It's kind of there's a danger that this is all about toys for the boys, but in fact I do see that this is something we need to be working on now and that has the potential to really achieve some huge increases in effectiveness and efficiency down the track. But the other thing I'd like to talk about is how we integrate the work that we're doing a bit better. Right now, as a result of a review that Hugh Sweetman did as part of the Integrated Monitoring Framework, he found that there were, I think, currently 63 monitoring programs on the GBR, and most of them are independent programs that don't necessarily talk to each other. They have, in some cases, uncertain funding, and they're not necessarily optimized for addressing the key questions that they were originally planned to do. There would be a huge increase in efficiency if we were able to make sure that all the various monitoring efforts were properly combined, because in many cases there are common data sets that are needed by different monitoring programs in order to be able to do the kinds of comparisons that they ought to be designed to do. So we can actually get increases in efficiency that way, but we can also then look at standardizing methodologies, which is an important issue, and reducing duplication. The other thing is by having proper integration and making sure that all the various drivers and pressures are being monitored in a consistent way at the same place by all these monitoring programs is where we're looking at the indicators of outstanding universal value. You can actually increase the types of inference you can make from these monitoring programs. So, for instance, we can compare zoning fish and corals together to look at the impacts of zoning. We can look at cyclones, dugongs, and seagrasses together. And right now, in some cases, these are being done under separate, different programs. So some examples of where plan comparison can make a big difference. After the last rezoning, there was an agreement to actually take the long-term monitoring program and actually cut it in two and do every second year some very specific comparisons between open and closed reefs. So we could really nail whether in fact the zoning had made a difference in terms of coral trout abundance. What you're seeing here is really quite unequivocal evidence that closing those reefs has made a difference. And in fact, if you uncast some of these models back earlier, it does seem to show that there's been a steady and progressive increase in difference between open and closed reefs. So that is very good news. The other area where the fact that we've got an integrated program that is looking at a number of different factors to address a bigger question is in the marine monitoring program, looking at water quality, where we're looking at a number of water quality indicators together with coral recruitment as well as coral cover. And that's allowed us to much more definitively document, in fact, for the first time, that decreases in water quality actually do result in major decreases in not only adult coral cover, but also in terms of recruitment. And some of the data are shown there. And having those integrated data sets that are coordinated and planned together allows us to have much more accurate indicators of status, which is what we have here and what is reported in the GBR report card. Now, one thing that we wanted to do to demonstrate the value of an integrated monitoring program, and which we've been able to get a bit of funding from the federal government for, is to say, well, look, it could be quite expensive and it's going to require a lot of additional effort. Why don't we start in one small area and invest in doing a case study in Townsville and say, what is it that an integrated monitoring program could really do? How would it work and what are the benefits we'd see? So that if we can actually demonstrate that in a very small area, it will help to actually encourage the government to support a fully integrated monitoring program across the rest of the GBR. So what we've done is we started in Townsville, where, in fact, we found that there's 12 monitoring programs already currently monitoring the status and impacts of coral reefs or seagrasses. There are 18 that are gathering information on pressures affecting these ecosystems, and most of them are not particularly well coordinated, and in some cases, there's very little intercomparability because of the fact they're using different methods. So what we're going to be doing is looking at what gains might be made from taking a different approach, and this is being led by Ken Anthony at Ames, where he's invented this impact tool, which is looking at integrated monitoring program analysis and control tool, where in effect what we're saying is let's look at all the variables that are being collected. Let's see whether we can do some trend analysis and power analysis against specific hypotheses to find out whether the sampling that's going on now really is optimal, feed that back to try to get optimization, and then use that empirical data to develop models which allow us to actually expand the spatial domain around which we're making inferences, and use that to really look at some of these important management questions. So what we're going to be doing is looking at that available data to find out to what extent we could fit it into this type of framework, and use these loops to make suggestions as to how monitoring should be improved in the future. The final area that I don't have time to talk about is better communication. I think we started off doing monitoring where we produced data tables, and Ames was guilty of this, where we had our website that proudly displayed the results of our monitoring program in literally numerical tables. I think we've gone a little bit beyond that. We've now got report cards, but there's actually huge challenges in terms of how we present the data from complicated, extensive, comprehensive monitoring programs in a way that really makes a difference to people who need to make decisions about what to do next on a reef. So I won't go any further. The last slide just says that really, if we really want to have a monitoring program fit for 2050 and our vision for the reef at 2050, we've got to do better planning, we've got to do more innovation, we've got to integrate, and we've got to communicate better.